I'd like to welcome Ulrich Meyer from Colgate University. He's going to give a talk on brute facts. Yeah. All right. So take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. So this is the talk about the principle of sufficient reason. Principle of sufficient reason used to be discarded to the dung heap of history, but in recent years, people try to resuscitate it. It's having a bit of a moment. And I think that's a mistake. I think the principle of sufficient reason is like 1980s fashion. It's bad the first time around. Don't bring it back. So that's what I want to argue here. But to make the case a little bit more positive, the title is I want to argue in favor of brute facts. And by arguing in favor of brute facts, I'm going to argue against the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, so what are brute facts? Well, a fact, as I want to use the term here, is just a contingently true proposition. The necessary propositions don't count as facts, and I'm just going to identify facts with contingently true propositions because I want to sidestep the question of whether or not we need to admit an ontology of facts in addition to propositions. This is a paper about bruteness, not about facts. So those are the facts. A brute fact is one that lacks a complete explanation of why it obtained. Here are some candidates for brute facts. Yeah.
Somehow.
I see. I think you can't.
Thank you. Sorry, that was worse.
I need it.
No. Yeah. She broke it.
The camera might be mirrored as well by name, so they might not be able to read the slides. Did I screw it up? Sure. Oh, yeah. Doesn't seem it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Now that's the train of thought. That was it. Okay. So here's some candidates for brute facts. Random happenings in fancy worlds. Suppose you have a radium atom that in the actual world, the radium atom decays at a particular time. The time of the decay of the radium atom, by virtue of being chancy, is inexplicable. There's nothing you can say about why the radium atom decayed at this particular time rather than at some other time. So random happenings in chancy worlds are candidates for brute facts. Also, laws and constants of nature in any world are candidates for brute facts. There's nothing more you can say about why, say, the speed of light or Planck's constant has the precise value that it does. It's a brute fact about the actual world. The friends of brute fact alert. Finally, initial and boundary conditions in any world are brute. There's nothing more you can say about why the world started out in this particular time and about whether or not, in terms of boundary conditions, if you have an infinitely extended space, why there aren't any kind of space indicators of the time that John Erman talks about. So here's some candidates for brute facts. Bruteness comes in degrees. If you think about the decaying radium atom, you can give some reason for why the radium atom decayed right now, say. Surely one of the reasons is that there was a radium atom an undecayed radium atom right before. Now, radium atoms can only decay once. So you can give a partial explanation, but you can't give a complete explanation. And with some of the other stuff, especially about initial conditions, they seem to be completely brute in that there's nothing you can say about. So what the friends of brute facts say is that there's some facts when asked about why to obtain, there's nothing else you can say about it, then the world just happens to be that way. Notice that bruteness, yes, it's like a bit what can and cannot be explained, but bruteness is really insensitive to the precise details of your theory of explanation. Yeah, brute fact is one that doesn't have any explanation, rather than an explanation that satisfies the exacting demands of some theory of explanation. It's not about lack of explanatory excellence, it's just having no explanation at all. So I'm not going to say anything about what I don't have any theory of explanation to sell, but I'm going to try to sell you the brute facts. Okay, brute facts need to be distinguished from unknowable facts. We can know by observation that a radium atom decays. So it's knowable, but that does not change the fact that it is brute. What we cannot explain is why the radium atom decays at that particular time. So here's the first distinction, a distinction between what I call reasons and evidence. So a reason for a fact explains why a fact obtains. Evidence is something that justifies the belief that something is a fact. But of course, evidence, what I want to call evidence isn't the only thing that does that. If you have an explanation for a fact, a sufficient explanation is also going to give you a reason for believing that it is a fact. Yeah, so both reasons and evidence might provide you with enough justification for belief that something is a fact. But they do it in different ways. So here's suppose you have a fact. Reasons for a fact typically as something obtains before the fact comes into existence. It might be initial conditions, boundary conditions, facts about the laws that were already in place, what the constants of nature are, and so on. They obtain before the fact. And the reasons explain the fact. Evidence, so evidence also speaks, evidence also justifies the belief that something is a fact. But in the case of observational evidence, it doesn't explain it. Usually it's the other way around. It's the fact that explains the evidence. The fact that there was a radium atom decay explains why you now have some particular observational evidence. That's a general insight in philosophy of science that with regard to observation, explanation, confirmation kind of go in opposite direction. Observation confirms a theory if and only if the theory explains the observation. So that's something similar is going on here, right? So that the evidence for the radium atom decay doesn't explain the fact, it's the other way around. And typically the evidence that you're going to get comes afterwards. Not the reason, but before the evidence comes afterwards, the fact is smack in the middle. Okay, so those are brute facts, and there's reasons and evidence. So here is in very broad outlines, a view that I want to call rationalism, or at least some version of rationalism, perhaps an extreme version of rationalism. Rationalist is somebody who subscribes to the principles of sufficient reason, the thing that I think is false, which is that every fact has a sufficient reason. That is true that all facts can be known by reason alone. Now, reason is going to give you justification for belief that something is a fact, just as evidence does. If the principle of sufficient reason is true, you can always go the reason route. If everything has a reason, you have to figure out the reason to be justified in belief. However, facts can have both reasons and evidence. So the fact that the rationalist thinks that all facts can be known by reason alone, but they don't think it's the only way of doing it. That's like a familiar feature that that rationalists regularly admit is that figuring out things by reasoning alone is very, very hard. And perhaps you're not very good at reasoning, and perhaps only God can ultimately figure out everything by reason. But we can still know stuff without reasoning everything from first principles, because we have observation. Observation is a little bit like reasoning for dummies. I just look at the solution and there it is. So the rationalist or the radical rationalist thinks all facts can be known by reason alone, admits empirical knowledge, but what the rationalist has to deny is that it's the existence of brute facts. That is, facts that can only be known by evidence, such as I think the fact that there was a radium atom decay is something you can only know by evidence, not by reason. Okay, that's a rationalist. The empiricist is somebody who denies the principle of sufficient reason. Calling the empiricist, there are brute facts. I gave you some examples. Random events in chancy worlds, laws of constant of nature, initial boundary conditions. So there are these brute facts, counterexamples of the principle of sufficient reason. Now, of course, also an empiricist thinks that facts can have reason, but ultimately, a radical empiricist thinks that all facts can only be known by evidence. So here, with a fact, you might provide a reason. If you're passing along the task of justification, you have a reason for a fact, and the reason might have a reason, and the reason of the reason might have a reason, and so on. But the empiricist claims that ultimately, for a fact, you can only get that far with reason. At some point, you have to appeal to evidence. Yeah, and the list of A, B, C, like my favorite brute facts, that's kind of the natural. If you really chase the explanations all the way to the end, I would submit this is where you end up. The broadly kind of scientific world, you're going to end up with initial conditions, laws of nature, constants of nature, boundary conditions, or chancy happenings. Okay, so that's empiricist view. Empiricist accepts brute facts. However, the empiricist is not enamored of brute facts. Empiricist doesn't want to have more brute facts. On the contrary, empiricism is broadly inspired by scientific inquiry. And if you think about a scientific theory, the business of a scientific theory is to explain. And a theory that explains more and thus postulates fewer facts, it's a better theory. So even empiricists can accept something, which I want to call the parsimony principle, which is that it's better to have fewer brute facts. But what I gave you the list, A through C, that's I would suggest that's like the shortest list you can have. Or something like that wrong. Okay. So we have the counterexamples, right? It's already an argument against the principle of sufficient reason. Yeah, here are these facts. I don't have an explanation. You don't have one either. Rationalist, and we went. But also other types of objections to the principle of sufficient reason. One is a version of Buridan's ass, so named after John Buridan, and ass is not the rear end, but it's like a donkey, right? The story is that we have a donkey between two exactly similar bales of hay, and right in the middle, and the poor donkey, not having sufficient reason for turning left or right, starves to death. A more modern version of that is that you might think there are also the following types of brute facts. Think about world history, kind of the sequence of all events, and unfolds in a certain way. And you might wonder that there are also brute facts about how all of world history is located in space. That is, here's the way it's actually located, and couldn't we have also moved everything over by 1 meter? And it seems, but if we do that, we get a qualitatively indistinguishable arrangement, given the homogeneity of space. And so isn't it a brute fact about this world where world history unfolds? Yeah, that's like, on the face of it, might be another brute fact and a counterexample. But of course, everybody knows this argument. That's Leibniz's shift argument. against substantivalism about space and in favor of relationism. Leibniz says, look, if spatial substantivalism were true, if space existed independently of its content, if it were the way like Newton thinks it is, homogeneous, isotropic, and so on, then there wouldn't have been any sufficient reason for God to place world history this way, rather than everything shifted over one meter. So for Leibniz, who accepts the principle of sufficient reason, that's an argument in favor of a theory of space and the relationism about space that doesn't allow you to have that kind of counterexample. So the rationalist just thinks the argument cuts the other way. Now, one recent defense of principle of sufficient reason, and most of the defenses I'm going to mention, the title of the paper is always something like this principle of sufficient reason. So here's one by Belot, who thinks that you argue that we can always diffuse symmetry-based counterexamples to the principle of sufficient reason by identifying indistinguishable possibilities. So here we have a counterexample that relies on some symmetry, and here's one that's symmetry on the spatial translations of all of world history. He thinks that what we can do in that case, we just take the quotient space under this equivalence relation, we eliminate the extra structure, and we get rid of the counterexample. He might very well be right about that. He has some more technical issues to make it stick in general, but the parsimony principle yields the same result. It's not as if empiricist has anything to object about the argument in favor of relationism about space if it were successful. Yes, there's like Newton's bucket argument, rotating bucket argument might be against it in some way, but empiricists broadly are in agreement about the conclusion of the argument with a different principle. They don't use the principle of sufficient reason. And in any case, this move does not eliminate any of the counterexamples A through C. Yeah, so there's a potential counterexample we offer here, but I don't think it's the best example of a group fact. So I'm going to grant below the point that we can, with this particular kind of counterexamples, we can always get rid of them. But I don't think there's anything that an empiricist has to object here, and it doesn't get rid of the hard cases A through C. So that's one point. The other point is that most people think that principle of sufficient reason runs into more serious difficulties, and that is the necessitarian collapse problem. It's unclear who first came up with it. Peter van Inwagen often gets credit for it, but other people at the same time have some idea. And the insight here is that principle of sufficient reason entails that there are no facts. Here's how the argument goes. Let's see, be the set of all facts, that is, the set of all contingently true propositions. And that R be a sufficient reason for why C contains the elements that it does contain. So you have R, now R is supposed to be a sufficient reason for why C contains the elements that it contains. Okay, so we have R as a reason. For R to be a reason, it must be true. Right? Only truths can explain. Only truth can come as reasons. Okay, so R must be true, but if R is true, then it's either contingently true or necessarily true. R can be contingent, the argument continues, because if R were contingent, R would be an element of C, and we can't admit such circular explanations without trivializing the principle of sufficient reason. We can't have R explain itself. So R cannot be contingent, so it must be necessary. But anything that a necessary truth is a sufficient reason for also has to be necessary. So the only way for R to be a sufficient reason for C, a sufficient reason for why C contains the element that it does, is for C to be empty. If R is contingent, it's necessary that C is empty. So there are no facts. There are no facts. There are no contingently true propositions. All propositions, if true, are necessarily true. All right, so here's an intermediate conclusion. I've got like 20 slides, intermediate conclusion, but slide 9. So I'm not lying about this. That was like when I started on this business, the first trick somebody told me was, no, Ulrich, I'm going to give a talk. And yeah, you still have a lot to say. To put the audience at the ease, just tell them, well, to wrap up, and everybody's going to breathe. And you can talk for another hour before they realize what's going on. Okay, intermediate conclusion. Well, we have these counterexamples to the principle of sufficient reason, A through C. And PSR collapses into necessitarianism. Conclusion, PSR is false. PSR is false. That's intermediate conclusion. Now, I don't want to overplay the argument here. When you think about necessitarianism, the view that all truths are necessary. Some rationalists, of course, accept that. Now, Leibniz thinks or seems to think that all truths are analytic. Yeah, and all analytic, they're not necessary. So Leibniz would have been happy to accept this. Most other people think it's false. It isn't all that obvious what a good argument against necessitarianism persisted. So you might think that, well, I know what's false. Take any of our physical theories, Newtonian mechanics, quantum mechanics, theory of relativity. They all have continuum many models. And each of these models is describing a possibility. Now, these theories are consistent, and you have all these models, so there are all these possibilities described by these theories. So necessitarianism is false. But of course, all of that assumes that our theories are indeed consistent, and all our theories are assumed the calculus, and we know from Gödel's incompleteness theorem that we can't prove the completeness of any of these theories, and with these bad experiences with Russell's paradox, who knows, tomorrow some clever person is going to come along and prove that the calculus is inconsistent, right? So do we really know that these theories that have infinitely many models that are all consistent? Perhaps you don't. Right? So that it's not completely clear that necessitarianism is untenable as a Belot. Now, with the counter examples of the principle of sufficient reason, it might be that what we regard as brute, there actually is an explanation for it. So we could revisit that issue, but so far, no rationalist has ever given an explanation of these things. Right? So with these rationalists, what they do is they just announce this great principle, but they don't actually tell you about a sufficient reason for why the speed of light is what it is, or why the initial boundary conditions are the way they are. Now, for none of these things have actually kind of given us a sufficient reason. So, kind of, it's an intermediate conclusion. So, to me, there seems to be an untenable principle of sufficient reason. So, why are people still talking about the principle of sufficient reason? And there's a good reason why people abandoned the principle of sufficient reason a long time ago. So why are we going back to it? So that's what I want to consider now. And the diagnosis that I want to offer is that people are really talking about something else. They're not talking about the principle of sufficient reason. They have this other reason, and this other principle, and it might even be true, but it doesn't help the principle of sufficient reason, as is usually understood. All right, another distinction. We also need to distinguish brute and fundamental facts, I think. And that's going to be important. What do I mean by that? Well, some facts can be reduced to other facts, or grounded in other facts, or whatever you want to call them. Or they supervene on other facts. And some disagreement about the precise relation, but it's the idea that idea of reduction. For example, facts about consciousness, you might think, can ultimately be reduced to the facts about the location of elementary particles. Now, facts about consciousness are really just about the brain, and what the city brain is in. The brain is kind of ultimately just made up of these elementary particles. Facts about consciousness can be reduced. Yeah, so some facts are meant to reduction, others are not. So a fundamental fact is one that cannot be reduced any further. A fact can be brute without being fundamental and can be fundamental without being brute. For example, facts about location, you might think, are fundamental, but not brute. So now whether or not an electron is located at a particular point right now might be a brute fact. It cannot be reduced to anything else. But it might be perfectly explicable in terms of where the electron was 5 minutes ago, what the attendant conditions are, what the laws of nature are, and so on. So locations are explicable, but it might be fundamental. Facts can also be brute without being fundamental. Imagine the world comes into existence with somebody in a particular state of consciousness. Right? God made the world, there was straightaway, there was Adam, and Adam was already in a state of consciousness, was born, that's why that Eve was made. So Adam is in the state of consciousness, first moment. Is there any kind of, okay, if you ignore the God story, it's a brute fact that can't be explained in terms of anything else. But it's still not a fundamental fact because it still can be reduced to facts about the locations of elementary particles. Yeah, so we have bruteness and fundamentality, different features, independent features. What's at stake here? Really two different questions. One is the question of what makes something the fact that it is. You think about consciousness. What makes it the case that you are now in a particular state of consciousness? There are things that we can say about it. Yeah, we can say, well, what makes it the case is that you see fibers are firing in this particular pattern, or the elementary particles in your brain are arranged in a certain way. That's what makes it the fact. That's what makes this consciousness fact the fact that it is. The other is the question of why something is a fact in the first place. Yeah, and you can say you can have a good answer to one without having a good answer to the other. So what I want to propose is to pry apart these two questions about why something is a fact and what makes it the fact that it is. I want to add a further distinction. So we already have the reasons and the evidence. I want to add grounds. Yeah, so what is a ground? Ground is something that explains what makes something the fact that it is. Yeah, so C fiber firing, locations of the elementary particles. There might be a grounds for the facts about the fact concerning the state of consciousness. So that's a ground. Explains what makes something the fact that it is. A reason explains why a fact obtains. Of course, now the problem is also, reason is something that explains why a fact obtains, but a ground does that too. Now if you ask why I'm in this particular state of consciousness, clearly one explanation is, because the C fibers are firing this way. Or the elementary particles are arranged in a certain way. It really does explain why this fact obtains. Yeah, so let me kind of rule that out by stipulating that what counts as a reason is something that explains why a fact obtains without providing a ground. Yeah, ground explains what makes something fact that it is. A reason explains why a fact obtains without going the ground route. And then we still have the evidence justifies the belief that something is a fact without providing a ground or a reason. I'm stipulating. I want to pry apart the grounds and the reasons. That's the main thing. So before we have this picture, right? We have a fact, a reason, typically something goes before. It explains why the fact obtains. Evidence typically comes after. It doesn't explain the fact, but it gives you good reason for believing there is a fact. If it's basically well, kind of grounds are typically simultaneous. Yeah, ground for a state of consciousness is, obtains at the same time as you're in that particular state. Okay. So, of course, it's all these things are they do similar things, right? So if you want to ask for justification in believing that something is a fact, you can provide evidence, you can provide reasons, and you can also provide grounds. They all do that. Now, in terms of going to explain the fact, well, the ground explains what makes it the fact that it is, whereas the reason explains why it is a fact. A reason is something that only explains why it is a fact. Doesn't explain what makes it the fact that it is. So the idea is that we have two types of explanation. I suppose we have a fact. A ground tells you what makes it the fact that it is, and the grounds can have grounds. If you have something without a ground, you get something fundamental. Like if you go on vertically, but at the same time, chase down the grounds, you might end up with a fundamental fact. But it can, then the reason is typically something happened before and explains why it is a fact. And the reasons kind of reasons. And if that bottoms out, you can end up with brute fact. Now you chase down the reasons. If it never ends, you end up with a brute fact. If you chase down the grounds, if it ever ends, you end up with the fundamental fact. Okay. Then it had I mean, and then a bit of terminology here, because both are kind of doing explanations. Okay, so here's a different principle. The principle of sufficient ground. That is, every fact has a sufficient ground. Question is the principle of sufficient ground in better shape than the principle of sufficient reason? It might well be the case. So with this other principle, I want to say that's a different principle. Most of the authors I want to discuss now, they don't distinguish the two. What they defend is what I call the principle of sufficient ground, and they just call it the principle of sufficient reason. And I think that's kind of part of the problem. And they want to distinguish the two. Okay. So why might principle of sufficient ground be in better shape? One issue concerns the question of necessitarian collapse. Benjamin Schindler and Axel Steinberg argue that well, they don't distinguish between reasons and grounds, but they argue that the collapse problem does not arise for the principle of sufficient ground. Or as they put it, is that, yeah, so we have the principle of sufficient reason and had an unfortunate history, but the problem wasn't so much the principle, but how it was formulated. And in order to make sense of it, you need to formulate the principle of sufficient reason in terms of the notion of ground. And once you do that, a lot of problems go away. So they argue that the collapse problem does not arise for the principle of sufficient ground. So they can find flaws in the collapse argument. It turns on intricacies of grounding. So what I did is I had C, the set of all facts, and then R, the reason for the set of all facts. But and I made it look as if R just gives a sufficient reason for C, but of course that isn't quite true. C is either a set, and we're talking about what it takes to be an element of the set, or in some other versions of the argument, you take the conjunction of all the facts, and you look for sufficient reason for that. But that's a question of whether or not there is such a conjunction, especially if there are many conjunctions. And then there's a question of whether or not we really get the circularity if R is merely the conjunct of this long conjunction, and so on. So they think that the necessitarian collapse does not arise if we spell out the principle in terms of ground rather than in terms of reasons. Well, other people disagree. Chris McDaniel has an argument where he argues that the necessary collapse also occurs with these ground-based arguments, and another, there's a whole cottage industry by now of people trying to analyze this argument in the case of ground. There's an article that's coming out in analysis now, this guy trying to revisit that as well. I don't want to get into the details here. Now, this argument, I just want to ground. Well, perhaps the principle of sufficient ground is better off in this regard. The argument I'm going to make in the end is that even if you find something pretty to say, something good to say about the principle of sufficient ground, it doesn't really help because it's not a principle of sufficient reason. Right? It's only about what makes it a fact the fact that it is, and not why it is a fact in the first place. Okay, so that's one argument in the literature. Yeah, another issue is broadly related to a prioricity. How you can know all these things a priori. Yeah, an empiricist might be happy to admit that perhaps there aren't any brute facts because it turns out we don't need them, right? But a rationalist is somebody who claims to know a priori that everything has a sufficient. Now, Della Rocca in his 2010 article, he defends reason. He tries to sell the principle of sufficient reason to empiricists. He tries to persuade empiricists that they are really closet rationalists. And he doesn't distinguish between brute and fundamental facts, but let's kind of go with that for but he presents, right at the beginning of the article, a list of what he calls explicability arguments that he thinks everybody's going to accept. For example, he thinks that here's an argument. Consciousness depends on more fundamental features. Why? Because otherwise, consciousness will be inexplicable, and it isn't. And he has similar arguments against brute dispositions, modality, and so on. He says, look, here are all these arguments that all my empiricist friends accept. And that these explicability arguments, and it's really something like the principle of sufficient reason in disguise, or kind of put differently, what the principle of sufficient reason ground demands is explicability of existence, right? If existence were primitive, didn't depend on more fundamental features, then it would be inexplicable, and it isn't. So he has this kind of, a kind of slippery slope argument. He says, look, you accept this explicability argument, and this other one, and this other one, and this other one. But how about this one? It's another argument of a similar type. What principle reason do you have for rejecting this principle, which for him is the principle of sufficient reason, while accepting all the others? So then, here what we have in terms of the explicability arguments is a question of grounds, not a question of reasons, as I call them. But you might be persuaded by Della Rocca that there's some good a priori principle that we have here. Let me briefly mention another one. I propose that facts about the laws of nature are brute. But you might wonder whether or not laws of nature are fundamental. Facts about laws of nature are fundamental. And clearly, Humean thinks that laws of nature reduce to the distribution of natural properties. Not only fundamental facts about laws of nature, it all supervenes. It's reducible to, grounded in the distribution of properties. That might well be the case, but all it does, it trades one kind of brute facts for another. Yeah, so laws might not be fundamental in this scenario, but we don't get rid of bruteness by treating them as non-fundamental. The other point I want to highlight here is that also with the previous argument about consciousness, about brute dispositions, and so on, there's a marked difference between the two types of explanation. Now, whether or not something counts as brute is really largely insensitive to the precise details of your favorite theory of explanation. And any account of explanation, and some of these things are just inexplicable. That's not the same in the case of fundamentality. Whether or not something counts as fundamental, or whether you regard it as fundamental, usually is a function of your broader metaphysical views. Just take the case of consciousness. If you're a substance dualist, you might just think that no facts about consciousness, they're fundamental or not. That's only if you're some sort of physicalist that you think you have to explain facts about consciousness in a different way. Here, whether or not the laws of nature are fundamental depends on your account of the metaphysics of laws. You might be human, you might have, you might also have like David Armstrong's view about what the laws of nature are. So we have these two directions of explanation, and the grounding explanations, people can call them metaphysical explanations, but they really are metaphysical explanations in terms of whether or not any of these are good or complete, whether they terminate in something, largely depends on the other metaphysical commitments. And it's not clear. If you go back, if you think about the way Della Rocca motivates the principle of sufficient reason, you already have to take a lot of kind of metaphysical commitments passively on board to be moved by any of these explicability arguments. Okay, but if you buy into all of that, you might find something good to say about the principle of sufficient ground. Okay. Brisk progress. So principle of sufficient reason depends on the root facts. If everything has a reason, there can't be something without a reason. Principle of sufficient ground says that everything has a ground. And you might be more, so it depends on sufficient reason, you're going to have, we're worried that we're going to get infinitely descending chains of reasons. You ask, why this? You ask, well, because of this other thing. Why that? Well, because of this third thing. Why the third thing? Because of the fourth thing. But we never kind of come to complete reason. You might have kind of regress worries in that case. You might have the same worries in the case of grounds, where you might think that they're more disturbing the case of grounds. If you want to ask, what makes this the fact that it is? And you give a ground. And then, well, what makes the ground, in fact, the fact is? And you give a ground, and you just kind of keep chasing down. You might think that someone, kind of the grounding has to bottom out, it has to be well founded, there has to be some fundamental facts. So you might be more comfortable with a more moderate version of a principle of sufficient ground, on which everything that needs a grounding explanation has one. And you might be happy to have some stopping points for grounding explanation. Shamik Dasgupta, in his defense of the principle of sufficient reason, he has a version of that. So he's happy with necessitarianism, I should say. But he makes a distinction between what he calls autonomous and non-autonomous facts. So autonomous facts, he thinks essentialist truths are autonomous facts, and they don't need an explanation. And then he has this project that all non-autonomous facts have essentialist explanations, or explanation, logic grounding explanation. So that's his project here, to defend the principle of sufficient reason, principle of sufficient ground. Here are these things that need no explanation, and everything else has an explanation of this particular type. It can be reduced to these essentialist claims. Let me give you an example of that. The DMV example. Here's a question. Why is the DMV closed on President's Day? Which, of course, for non-Americans invites two questions. What on earth is the DMV, and what is President's Day? The DMV is the Department of Motor Vehicles. Every state has one. Some states call it the DMV. Others call it the RMV, the Registry of Motor Vehicles. It's a place where you go to register your car, so you get a license plate, and you also get your driver's license at the DMV. Like the first time around, if you move to a different state, you have to go to the DMV, get new license plates, get the new driver's license. Okay? That's the DMV. President's Day is a public holiday to commemorate the birth of George Washington. Soon to be moved to Trump's birthday, but we know that. So we have President's Day. So at first it was Washington, and then then people also wanted to celebrate Lincoln, and so now it's like over time it's become what to celebrate all the presidents and the good, the bad and the ugly. Okay, so why is the DMV close to President's Day? So let's put this. So look, my son asked me, well, what's the DMV close? Here's an explanation. And it's going to be a essentialist explanation. Well, he thinks it's in the very essence of President's Day that it is a public holiday. Yeah. That's all. It's part of what the President's Day is. And he also thinks that non-essential public services are closed on public holidays. Yeah, that's again, it's part of the essence of public holidays and non-essential public services. And the DMV is a non-essential public service. You know, different views when you need new driver's license on President's Day. So I think here were these three essentialist truths. And jointly they explain why the DMV is closed on President's Day. It's a non-essential public service as part of the essence of the DMV. Part of the essence of non-essential public service is closed on public holidays, or perhaps it's the essence of public holidays, and then President's Day is one of them. Yeah. That's what explains it. And so that's how this reducing of the non-autonomous facts to autonomous facts work out. But if you look at it, it's like even if you have worries about the essentialist claim, what it doesn't tell you is it doesn't explain the very existence of the DMV and the President's Day. It doesn't explain why there would be such a thing as a DMV and a President's Day, and why the President's Day would fall on a certain day, and why I know that the driver's licenses and the car registrations are in the same office. So perhaps they explain something, and that's also a Brownian explanation, but it's limited. Right? There can a lot of facts that just doesn't explain. And my complaint is that something similar is true of that all these versions of principles of sufficient grounds. So yeah, that final conclusion. The grounds of a fact don't tell us why it is a fact, or ultimately. I give grounds and grounds and grounds and grounds. It tells you what sort of fact it is. But unless you have something other than a ground that tells you that one of the kind of grounding fact actually obtains, there's some explanation of why one of the grounding things obtain. Your explanation of why it is a fact. Yeah, if you think about my candidate for brute facts, that some of the brute facts aren't fundamental. You can reduce them to something else, but the grounds don't tell you why these facts obtain. So principle of sufficient grounds does not eliminate the brute facts that I started out. So first one, chance occur random events in chancy worlds. Now you can know everything there is to be known about the grounds of radium decay without knowing why it decayed at the time it did decay. And similar, I said, what laws of nature, initial boundary conditions. So I don't think there's and I think we should kind of argue about who gets to own the word principle of sufficient reason. But I think that if I get to keep all of my brute facts A through C, then you don't have a principle of sufficient reason. Yeah, and unless we get rid of that, the bruteness of those things, whatever you have might be a great principle, and perhaps you should call it principle of sufficient ground, but it isn't a principle of sufficient reason as is kind of ordinarily construed. So I think PSR is still false. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're gonna move to Q&A, but before we do that, I'm gonna ask y'all a question. Namely, would you all like to come out for dinner with us? We're going to go to a pizza place, what's the pizza place called? Something in 31?
Helvetia 31. It's a pizza place which is close by. 5 minutes walking.
Very close, no excuses, oh, too far, blah, blah, blah. So if you would like to come along with us, will you just raise your hand, please? Oh, maybe we should go out for drinks first before we go to, yeah, so then I can pull more of out for drinks. So we'll go to, Oops for like a, what do you call it, aperitif boat? Yeah, nice good stuff.
You asking me out?
Yeah, and I don't know. So we go there. To Oops, and then put your hands back for the pizza, so we see, one, two, no, three, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so 6, so at 7:30?
7:30.
Okay.
I should say that this totally dates you guys. Like for undergraduates, free food, they go for you, like 5 minutes walk. I don't know.
Okay, so now, if you have questions, now that you've mulled it over and thought about stuff, now you can think about what you want to ask. So if you just, I'll just ask you to raise your hands if you have questions, and I will try to get you to you as we go. So questions. That was plural. Yeah, okay. All right, well, start us off.
Thank you. It was really interesting. I have sort of 2 questions. Maybe I could do like one right now. But the first one is just clarification.
Yeah.
It's about the PSG and so and about what you were calling explainability.
Yeah.
Because sort of explainability seems to be like the word that encompasses both
Yeah.
the PSR and the PSG. And I wonder if sort of because, for example, Della Rocca talks a lot about like the explanatory demand and
Yeah.
physics, etc.
Yeah.
So I wonder if the PSG also has that aspect with regards to explanations. Like, would someone that holds a PSG hold that there are no unexplainable facts?
Well, it depends a little bit about what you so we have these 2 types of explanation, and the one that I think is easier to try to pull out is to explain a fact by specifying a ground which is to explain what makes for the fact that it is. And then so that's the ground, and reasons as anything else, right? That's how I wanted to go to pry the 2 apart. And I think what makes this hard to see a way through is that both are kind of forms of explanation. But in the case of the grounding explanation, typically it's a question of how to fit in a fact in some sort of preconceived picture of what the ontology is. And I think what kind of explain more requirements. Right, so you have to explain how it is, what if you think of physicalist, right? How does kind of oughtness enter in physical as well? You have to explain it, and you kind of have to explain what makes facts about more requirements facts. So so that's kind of the grounding explanation. It's clearly an explanation, and it's without doubt. It does without doubt raise important questions. I don't want to diss the principle of sufficient ground. I don't want to diss the notion of grounding. It just what I want to insist on is that it's asking a different kind of question than the principle of sufficient reason originally. If you kind of look at early modern philosophers, that one really exercised the one ground for the interest in explanation. So when people try to bring back the principle of sufficient reason, say, well, we now have this better notion of ground. I think that is really changing the topic. You might get an interesting issue. It might be about explanation, but it's a different issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. it's a question with a very big if, but since I am not clear a concept about brute facts, if libertarian free will were true, would choices be brute facts or not? Because it seems to me that if they are not, you could have a reason that doesn't make the fact necessary. Because you could say, well, I choose to wear a jacket this morning, and there is a reason, like why? Because because I have free will and I choose so, but that does not make the choice necessary, because I could have chosen other ones.
Yeah. Well, I think in that respect, that a libertarian account of free will, any instance of exercising your free will will be, in that regard, would be a little bit like a transient occurrence in a non-deterministic world.
Yeah.
I think yeah. Of course, there can be kind of partial reasons, but if it's just, look, I just decided, I used my free will and decided to act this way. Yeah, I think that would be regarded as brutes, and of course, a compatibilist might
Yes.
might say that's precisely, well, that's the wrong kind of free will, because chancy actions aren't free actions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in this case, also like as an hypothesis, there was like a god with free will who made the laws of the world, and those will be still brute facts.
Well,
if they are made with a free choice without necessary.
But of course, if it were the case that if Leibniz were right about God, he has all the divine attributes, and he looks at all the possible worlds and picks the best one, right?
Well, I mean,
so that would be the case where then there wouldn't be we have a complete explicability if also facts about God's existence and would be probably
Let's wait. Some questions online.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, did you want to?
Yeah, we can do
Is it
that.
related to the?
No, it's a
We'll go to the It's queued up. Is it?
Hi, thank you. I have two related questions. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you started out saying that brute facts are contingently true propositions.
Yes.
And then you said whether there are both contingently true propositions and brute facts is a question. I guess you didn't answer that question, right?
No, so I started out by saying that a fact that says, I just identified facts with contingently true propositions. And then the question was whether amongst those facts, some are brute. But fact that says any contingent propositions.
Okay, but my real question is when you get to A through C, B and C, wait, B is laws and constants of nature in any world, and C is initial and boundary conditions in any world. Well, doesn't adding in any world make them necessary?
No, sorry. In any world, I meant deterministic or not. So
I'm sorry, you said any world what?
Sorry. So perhaps I should have left that out, would have made it clearer. So in A, the brute facts of type A were random occurrences in chancy worlds. Only if a world is chancy do you get brute facts of type A. and ours appears to be chancy. So A, you only get in chancy worlds. B and C, I would suggest you get in any possible world. Or perhaps not in worlds without loss. But yeah. I didn't mean to suggest that the laws of nature or the constants of nature are necessarily the way they are. You're right about that.
Okay, thank you.
Another question?
Let me just write that out.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Kevin Morris. I'm from Tulane in the United States. Thank you all for letting me be part of this. I think I really like the distinction between ground, reason, and evidence. I think that was very useful and interesting. I'm just wondering, I have a couple questions, maybe just say more about the distinction between ground and reason. So, and how much that might depend on like maybe different views of causation and explanation. So, I mean, I was thinking in this context, like when I thought about different examples, like reason-based explanations, as you're understanding it, like causal explanations typically came to mind, distinct from these kind of constitutive grounding-based explanations. And I was thinking about, a certain, like Jonathan Schaffer, for instance, thinks that there's a lot of similarities between grounding and causation. So at least formal similarities, and then maybe more similarities. Like, so on certain views of causation, there might be modal similarities between grounding and causation, which seems to be at least what's going on in a lot of the reason-based explanations as you're understanding it. So I guess I was just wondering, just maybe a little more clarification on like, maybe this would be a way in which issues about causation might be relevant, where, or maybe suggesting that this difference between ground and reason may depend on substantial commitments, may not be that deep if we take certain commitments rather than others, or maybe have turn in part on some issues with explanation as well. So I know that's kind of broad, but I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit, a little more of the distinction, ground and reason, and these kind of issues about similarities between like grounding and causation, for instance. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for kind of pushing me on the reasons thing. I should make that clearer as well. So you're absolutely right. The way I used reason here, often the reasons for a fact might just be causes of the fact. And you're absolutely right. You're right. That just as we kind of use explanation in many different senses. One of kind of giving a ground, giving a reason in my sense. Of course, there are also reasons for actions. And reasons for actions aren't always causes of actions. You're absolutely right about that. I should make that clearer, that that the way I'm using reasons here is like it's in a technical sense, not in the ordinary sense of the word. So I want so not only, you're absolutely right, not only do I have to kind of distinguish reasons from the grounds, I also have to distinguish all about reasons that explain why something is a fact from kind of the reasons for actions that you mentioned. Thank you very much. On the other, similarities between reasons, grounds, and causation, I think that's true. Kind of if you think about a more limited principle of sufficient reason, which doesn't try to give a reason for every fact, but only tries to give reasons for the occurrences of events. And not all facts are occurrences. For example, facts about the laws of nature and facts about what the constants of nature are like. Those aren't facts. Those aren't occurrences of events. So if you think about principle of sufficient reason where we only want to have sufficient reasons for the occurrence of events, that is going to look very much like a principle of causation, that every event has a sufficient cause. So I think in that case, reasons in my sense, and causes are largely going to coincide. I think you're absolutely right about that. Are reasons similar to grounds? Yeah, they are in that, are causes similar to grounds? I think they are, and that can both have this kind of explanatory power to explain an event. You can explain an event by providing sufficient cause of the event, or say something about its causal history. I think that is true. So I'm not sure that these similarities really help to clarify things. I think that has served to muddy the waters. Because again, many different senses we have of explanation and reasons. It's kind of hard to pry them apart. So that's why here I'm kind of struggling a little bit, like finding the right words for the distinctions I want to make. And yeah, thank you. I'm going to try to think about ways of making that clearer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Isn't there someone else?
There's a repeat.
Please.
Oh,
Yeah.
you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so you give two main reasons for not holding the PSR, right?
Yeah.
So the first one are the cases A to C, and the second one is collapse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for someone that isn't a rationalist, I see how those are very convincing reasons not to hold a PSR. But for a rationalist, I wonder how convincing those might be, right? The second one is clear that many just bite the bullet and accept it. And the first one, one might ask, like, why, right? Like a rationalist might ask why those facts are root, right? And if a possible answer is that we have an explanation for why these facts are root, and another possible answer is that these facts are just like root these roots, right? In the second case, it would be like sort of begging the question, right? Like, look, I have these brute facts here. Brute facts exist because brutally they exist, right? But in some cases, we might have reasons to hold that these facts are brute. In case A, I see perfectly how for random stuff, you either have an explanation for why it is brute that there are random happening. But for B and C, one actually might have to give a reason for why those facts are brute. And given that one might have to give a reason, it seems that also depends on one's metaphysical positions, right? B and C, because how one thinks the world works metaphysically might change if the laws and constraints of nature are in fact brute or not, right? But returning to necessitation, it seems that actually for a Leibnizian, the laws and constraints of nature are not brute. So I really don't see how this might be convincing for a rationalist.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about rationalists being convinced rationalists being unfazed about necessitarian collapse. I said, no, that's not an objection. That's the view, right? That is the view. And great that you discovered it as well with this little argument of yours. I think that's right, right? But with regard to what to say about A through C, I think part of it is a question about who has to shoulder the burden of proof here. And I think it's clearly the rationalist, because the rationalist who's advancing an extravagant thesis being that the world is suffused by reason. It's not just stuff happening. No, there's like but for the most minute thing in the world, there's kind of ultimately a reason why it had to be that way. They might well be right about that, but they need to earn that view. I think it can't just be the starting point of the debate. And with A through C, it's like, yeah, you can imagine a rationalist trying to provide a reason, but they haven't done any of those. Now, it's not clear that whenever you come up with a candidate for brute fact and the rationalists can't immediately find the complete reason for it that you kind of want, right? You think about, what the rationalist says is everything is explicable. And it's not clear that they can owe you immediately an explanation for everything. Think about, completeness theorem for first order logic. That's what every logical consequence is provable in the system. Right? That doesn't give you a procedure for finding a proof, because you can also prove that it's undecidable. So there's no such procedure. So you might think, yeah, you have this general principle, and then in particular, it's got to be hard to find in a particular case of something that is provable. It's going to be hard to find the proof. So likewise, with some facts, it might be hard to find a complete explanation for something that is presented as a brute fact. So I think the rationalist doesn't have to do all of it, but they have to do some of it. Right? And especially in the case of one, if you think about, so one with, I don't know how much you guys do that, philosophy of quantum mechanics. So we have like the decaying radium atom. And of course, Einstein, who like sometimes he's a crypto-positivist, sometimes a crypto-rationalist, right? He thinks God doesn't play dice. He had this view, so well, look, it has to be explicable. There have to be some hidden variables here that explain why it is. So underlying physics explains why it is that the radium atom decays at these particular. And then along comes Bell, and he shows that, like, if the theory of quantum mechanics is true, in the standard formulation, you can't reinterpret it as being about hidden variables. So here on the one side, we have a hard result, right? As it would buttress the thesis that is just a brute fact. And on the other side, where the rationalists who just don't do anything, just announce the principle and leave it at that. Right? So I'm not saying that it's a knockdown. Listing heterogeneity is a knockdown argument, but I think if you want to be a rationalist, you have to say something about that. And that's the hard part of being a rationalist. The grounding stuff, I think that's kind of relatively easy. It doesn't address that kind of fundamental issues, right? It's like if I had to give a 1-minute talk about the principle of sufficient reason and why it's false, I would just talk about the radium atom. That would be it.
Okay, so thanks for the talk. I was also thinking about the notion of a reason as you have defined it. I was before your talk, just giving for granted grounds counted as reasons in the relevant sense. And was also taking reasons not to include subjective reasons for action and the kind of objective notion of reason that one might have in mind. But now I'm trying to understand better what the family of reasons includes. So causation is there, but as you pointed out, so there might be some contingent truths that don't count as events. And so maybe something else should be there on top of causation. I was also thinking that maybe the kind of reasons that are typically given in this context might also include necessary truths. And these maybe also cannot enter causal relations. So can you help me understand what is there in the big family of reasons on top of causation?
Let me think a moment here. Can you give me an example of what you might think, what a necessary truth might be that counts as a reason?
I was thinking that maybe, we were discussing before about the possibility of finding reasons for contingent truths that are not contingent. So this seemed to be an open possibility. So I'm not sure actually what this might be the case, and it might be that due to collapse, this is actually not possible. But I was thinking that maybe this was supposed to be an open possibility, and so we need to have a way of maybe conceptualizing this.
Well, I mean, that's like, I mean, I'm working on the stuff as I'm giving the paper. There's the draft version of this paper. There's some other stuff about a more general principle. Yeah, you think about conversions of the principle of sufficient reason. Like the bottom level would be like would only be concerned about occurrence of events on which every event has a sufficient cause. That would so that means kind of if all events are historically necessary, then you can have a slightly stronger one on which kind of all events are kind of, there might be a view in which all events are nominally necessary. Imagine a world in which the laws of nature are categorical, they only have one model. So, and then like a third level is like all facts are just necessary as a full principle of sufficient reason. But you can even imagine an even more ambitious principle, which claims that all truths have sufficient reason. And then amongst the truths, there might be some where the reasons are trivial, like logical truths, analytic truths. But there are also going to be some truths that I think are much, much harder. Take the continuum hypothesis. So that's the view that there's no set of cardinality greater than the set of all the rational numbers, but smaller than the cardinality of the set of the real numbers. So there's no cardinal between Beth naught and Beth one, right? It's either true or it's false, right? Of the set theoretic hierarchy, and if you think that facts about sets are necessary if true, well, it's going to be one or the other. And on my way of putting it, it doesn't count as a fact because it's not contingent, right? And is there sufficient explanation for that? Well, I just don't think so. So if something like that or can enters into an explanation, or if some kind of metaphysical necessity, so something that's necessary a posteriori, that what is H2O, then if you appeal to that in some explanations, it might be that some of the reasons might not be facts. Okay, let's write that down. And this might include not facts. Yeah, I need to think about how that might kind of screw things up. I think that for the reason like the continuum hypothesis, axis of choice, existence of inaccessible cardinals, and so on. I think the idea that all truths have sufficient reasons, that strikes me as in worse shape than this more limited one is unconcerned about facts. But I mean, clearly, okay, let me give you some examples, and then as I give you the example, see if anything interesting to say about that. Mathematical truths clearly have explanatory power. Right? So here's two examples. You have some square tiles, and you try to put a rectangle, and you're unsuccessful. What explains that? Well, you have the number of tiles is prime. Right? You can do the rectangle. Another one is like, I don't know, you're a computer coder, and you try to write this useful app such that anybody can send a computer program to this app, and then the app is going to check the computer program and see whether or not this computer program will ever run into one of those infinite loops where you get like the spinning beach ball of death. And you think, well, I'm trying to do that, and I failed to do that. What explains it? And along comes your friend from computer science, tells you the whole thing problem is unsolvable. Okay? So here we have two explanations of failure that's being explained by some necessarily true mathematical truths. So they also have explained we have reasons, and it's clearly not a relation amongst facts as I construe them. I don't know whether yeah, I should certainly say something about that. You're right about that. Thank you.
And it's not grounding, right?
No, it's not
In this
grounding.
case.
Yeah.
No, it's a question. It was supposed to be a question, rather.
Yeah, as I said, trying to figure it out as I go along.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it's grounding because it's not. It's unless you have a more generous notion of ground, that might also be the case, right? As I'm using ground here, it's really the idea of reduction, with where kind of tells you something about what a fact is, and your failure to put, it's even it's I don't think the fact that the number of tiles is prime grounds the fact that you're unable to put them in the rectangle. Explains it, but isn't ground it also. That
I'm not sure.
yes, I mean, yes, so this so it sounds like you have a more generous notion of grounding than I have. So I need to find a good way of prying those two apart. I think that those are doing kind of two kind of fundamentally different things. One acts vertically, the other one acts horizontally, and they take you different places. And the ordinary notion of explanation kind of mushes the two together, and I want to pry them apart. Go ahead.
But the horizontal thing was working pretty well when there was a temporal distance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in this case, it doesn't seem that there should necessarily be a temporal distance between the mathematical, the mathematical paths and.
Yeah, I think perhaps I shouldn't kind of overplay my hand with the temporal order of these things.
Yeah, I was expecting you not to, but yeah. I mean,
But well, I want to have some sort of picture about how those things relate. So kind of, I mean, I didn't say much about that. So we have the grounds, the reasons, and the evidence, and there's a hierarchy, and kind of the lower ones transmit, the higher ones transmit the lower ones, right? So you have a fact, and you have a reason for the fact. Well, evidence for the reason typically is going to be evidence for the fact as well. Yeah, so reasons transmit evidence. Why does this happen? If you know about the evidence for the cause of if evidence for the sufficient cause of something in kind of non-pathological cases, also going to be evidence for the fact. If you have a fact, you have a ground. A reason for the ground typically is also going to be reason for believing that the thing that's being grounded with things. Yeah, so they're kind of between those three, there are those kind of interesting relations. Whether yeah, but that one is always simultaneous. Where the grounds always have to be simultaneous. Yeah, I don't want to bet on that, but say in ordinary cases, and of course also the transmission might fail in all the weird cases that we know from epistemology, where stuff doesn't close up and tell.
Would anyone like to get the final word question? Well, if you're too shy of a question now, then you should come with us to Oops, and you can ask it there. But let's thank our student once more. Okay. Right.
I had a question.
Yeah.
But it's not much.
Yeah, you.
Great. Then. Wow.